You're already settling in, and that's a good place to be. Picture this. It's Tuesday afternoon in London, 1907. The drawing room is quiet. The fire's been burning since mid-morning. Your husband has just left. Hat retrieved from the hall stand. A word to the butler, the front door closing behind him with a soft, definitive sound. He's gone to his club. He'll be back for dinner. And between now and then, the house is yours. Entirely, quietly, completely yours. You take a breath. The quietness settles. In a few minutes, the calls will begin. They called them morning calls. That's the first thing worth noticing. The name, morning calls. The problem is that they never, not once, happened in the morning. They happened every single afternoon, somewhere between 1 o'clock and 4, and every educated person in Edwardian England understood this completely. In the language of the era, morning referred to the entire stretch of time before the formal dinner hour, which meant everything before 7 or 8 in the evening was, technically, the morning. The logic was tidy. It also meant that the word morning was doing almost no work in the phrase at all, and nobody, across a century of this convention, ever thought to change the name, which tells you something about the era's relationship with its own habits, but set the name aside. Because what matters is not what they were called. What matters is what they were. The afternoon call, the ritual of visiting, of being received, of the card left in the hall and the conversation conducted over tea, was not a pleasant way for idle women to pass the time. It was a social operating system. It was how reputations were built and destroyed, how alliances were formed and dissolved, how a family moved upward through the layers of society, or quietly, without anyone saying a single word, ceased to be invited anywhere at all. The men at their clubs across town were doing something, it's true, but the women in the drawing rooms were doing something too. And in certain ways they were doing it with considerably more precision. You're lying somewhere comfortable right now, and somewhere in London in 1907, a woman is sitting very straight in a chair by the fire, waiting for the afternoon to begin. She's not unlike you in some ways. She has her routines, her quiet pleasures, her habits of thought. She simply lives inside a set of rules you would find, on close inspection, quite extraordinary. Let's start at the beginning of the day, because the afternoon doesn't make sense without the morning that preceded it. You won't be there for this part. These are the hours before you arrive in the drawing room, but they shape everything that follows. For an upper-class Edwardian woman, the day had a structure as fixed as a railway timetable. She didn't invent it each morning. It was simply the shape that days took, handed down through custom, reinforced by expectation, and managed through a combination of domestic authority and precise social choreography. If you had been born into this world, this structure would have been invisible to you. You wouldn't have noticed it. It would simply have been what mornings were. She woke late by working standards, not lazily, by design. The household had been awake since before dawn. The scullery maid and the hall boy had already lit fires, carried coal up from the basement, and completed tasks that needed to be invisible by the time the family stirred. The idea was not that the family required these things to be done. The idea was that the family should never need to think about whether they'd been done. The labour was real. The labour was simply not allowed to be seen. By 9 or 10 o'clock, the lady of the house was at her writing desk. And the writing desk was not decorative. It was the nerve centre of her day. The correspondence alone was substantial. Notes to accept invitations, notes to decline, thank you letters from last week's dinner. You know the kind of letter, the careful, politely phrased acknowledgement that costs nothing and communicates everything. A letter to her sister in the country, a note to the dressmaker, a response to the charitable committee she sat on. The sheer volume of letters that moved through an upper-class Edwardian household in a single week would be startling by modern standards, and she was responsible for all of them. Not her husband, not a secretary, her. The social intelligence required to manage this correspondence was considerable. Accepting an invitation was simple. Declining one was an art. You could not simply say no. You had to say no in a way that communicated continued warmth, that did not imply preference for any competing engagement, and that left open the possibility of a future yes without making a commitment you could not keep. The formula was regret, a brief gesture toward the reason without specifying it too precisely, and a warm close that reinstated the connection the absence might have endangered. It took, in the hands of someone who knew what they were doing, about 4 sentences, and it required you to hold in your head, while writing those 4 sentences, the entire social map of your relationship with the person you were declining, including what you had recently accepted from them, what they had recently accepted from you, and whether a refusal at this moment would read as a slight, or simply as a busy week. You have probably written this letter, not with the formal salutations and the stamped envelope, but the same letter. The email that says, "Yes, I'm so sorry I can't make it, but we absolutely should find a time." The same intelligence, the same invisible calculation. The Morning Post also brought social intelligence of a different kind. Invitations arriving from households she was watching. Cards from people who were, she suspected, testing the temperature of the relationship. Notes that required reading for what they didn't say, as much as for what they did. This was information management, conducted on paper, with the tools of social intuition rather than any formal system, and it happened every morning, before the consultation with the housekeeper, before the household accounts, before the rest of the day began. The writing desk itself was a deliberate piece of furniture, not the large masculine partner's desk of the library or the study. Those belonged to her husband's domain. The writing desk in the morning room was smaller, more personal, fitted with drawers for stationery, a slope for writing, and a small locked compartment for correspondence that was nobody else's business. The lock was real. It was not theatrical. The correspondence inside it was in some cases the only record of what this woman actually thought, as opposed to what she communicated, and she thought quite a lot. After the letters came the consultation with the housekeeper, a daily meeting at which the day's menu was decided, household accounts reviewed, and the roster of domestic tasks confirmed. This was not a brief conversation. If the household was preparing for a dinner party, the planning involved would not look out of place in a small events company today. Which wines to open? Which tablecloth for which china? Who among the guests had particular requirements? Whether the footman's livery was acceptable or required pressing. And this is your meeting, your decision, your household. The housekeeper waits. You make the call. There's an assumption most people carry without quite examining it, that an Edwardian woman of the upper classes did nothing, because she had servants to do everything. But managing a household staff of 8, 10 or 12 people is not nothing. Deciding what 12 people do, when they do it, how it should be done, and what it should cost. That is a form of management. It happened to take place in a house rather than an office. The skills required were real. The expertise was real. The work was real. It was simply never called work. By early afternoon, the housekeeping was done. The letters were written. The menus were set. The household was running. And you can feel the pivot of the day happening around 2 o'clock. Your husband has gone to his club. The quieter hours are here. Before we go further, a brief pause and a question I genuinely like knowing the answer to. Where are you right now and what time is it there? Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. I read them, usually far later than is sensible for a man running a sleep channel. And if this is the kind of thing you'd come back to, a subscribe means quite a lot to a small channel. Take a breath. Let the room settle around you. We've only just begun. The drawing room that you're heading toward now is not where you spend most of your day. That's the morning room. Smaller, warmer, more personal, facing east to catch the morning light. The drawing room is a different kind of space. It faces the street. It's larger. It's more carefully arranged. And on an at-home day, it's stage-managed with a precision that any theatre director would recognise. The furniture has been positioned. The fire burns at the right level, warm enough to welcome, not so fierce as to be stifling. The tea things are arranged on the small table near the window. There are flowers, seasonal ones, because unseasonal flowers would look as though you were trying too hard. Trying too hard was, in Edwardian drawing rooms, one of the more visible social failures available to you. The card tray in the entrance hall has been freshly polished. The hallmaid is ready. You are ready. You're wearing the right dress for afternoon reception. Not morning dress, that's been changed. Not evening dress, that comes later. Afternoon dress. There was a dress for everything in this world, and each one signalled to anyone who glanced exactly what time it was and exactly what kind of occasion this was. The wardrobe of a well-dressed Edwardian woman was not vanity, it was a communication system, and the woman who wore the wrong dress at the wrong time of day was making a statement, whether she intended to or not. You knew, always, what you were wearing. You knew what it said. The Edwardian silhouette is worth understanding, because it was not a natural shape, and it required considerable effort to maintain. The fashionable figure of the 1900s was the S-bend, achieved by a corset that pushed the chest forward and the hips back, creating a pronounced curve at both ends of the body. Walking in this silhouette required a particular posture. Sitting in it required adjustment. Receiving callers in it for 3 hours while maintaining the ease and warmth of a perfect hostess required a level of physical discipline that the histories of this period rarely acknowledge. The dress itself was a complex object. The afternoon gown of a woman of the upper middle class in 1907 might have involved 30 or 40 hours of a dressmaker's work. It was not bought off a rail, it was made, measured, fitted, adjusted, fitted again, adjusted again, in a process that required multiple visits to the dressmaker, and a relationship that was, in its way, as carefully managed as any of the social relationships in the card tray. The dressmaker occupied an unusual position in the social world. She was not a servant. She was a skilled professional who came to the house, or whose premises you visited, and who possessed a form of intimate knowledge of your body and your social calendar that nobody else had in quite that way. She knew which occasions were coming up. She knew which households you needed to impress, and which you could afford to take less trouble over. She knew, if she'd worked with you for several seasons, approximately what your budget was and how far it could be stretched. This relationship was typically loyal and long-standing. A good dressmaker was kept. Her name was not shared unnecessarily. She was, in her particular way, part of the household's intelligence network. The morning dress that you changed out of before the callers arrived was simpler, less constructed, more practical. It was what you wore to the writing desk, to the consultation with a housekeeper, to the management of the morning hours when the performance of the afternoon had not yet begun. The distinction between morning and afternoon dress was not about formality in any simple sense. It was about readiness. Morning dress said, "I am managing." Afternoon dress said, "I am receiving." Evening dress said, "I am on display." Each communicated a different mode of presence, and you moved through all three in a single day. The at-home hours in London were typically 3 o'clock to 5 or 6. And here is the thing about those hours, the part that tends to get lost when people describe Edwardian women as passive, confined, idle. Those hours were hers, not her husband's, not society's in any abstract sense, hers specifically, in the most concrete and operational meaning of the word. She decided who was received. She decided who was turned away. She decided through the precise management of those hours which families rose in her social world and which quietly, gently ceased to appear on her list. That power was real. It was just never called power. The way it worked in practice was this. A woman designated certain days of the week as her at-home days. These were printed on a small card, the at-home card, and sent to everyone in her social circle. If you were in that circle, you knew that on, say, Tuesdays and Thursdays between 3 and 6, you might call on her. You didn't need to announce yourself in advance. You simply arrived, handed your card to the maid at the door and waited, and then the maid went inside, and then she came back. She was either at home or she was not. And those two outcomes carried entirely different weights. If she was at home, genuinely receiving, the maid showed you in, took your coat and gloves, and led you upstairs to the drawing room. The hostess rose to greet you. Tea was offered. A conversation of approximately 20 minutes followed, its length and warmth calibrated to the precise nature of the relationship between you. Close friends stayed at the upper end of the window. Newer acquaintances aimed for the middle. Overstaying, extending past 30 minutes without a strong signal of invitation to do so, was a genuine social error. You would be aware of it the moment you did it, if you had any social intelligence at all. The hostess's expression would not change, the conversation would not falter, but something would shift. Something barely perceptible, and you would know. Too short was worse. Leaving in under 15 minutes communicated something unmistakable, that the visit had been duty, not pleasure, that you had come because etiquette required it, not because you wanted to be there. A good hostess could recover from it. The relationship often couldn't. 20 minutes was the sweet spot. 20 minutes was the duration that said everything was well between you, that the call had been paid with genuine attention, and that the world could go on as it had before. 20 minutes. That was the unit of social currency in this world, and people calculated it with the kind of precision you might now reserve for other things entirely. The conversation itself was not incidental to the exercise. It was the exercise, and yet the subjects available to you were, by modern standards, astonishingly narrow. You didn't discuss politics. You didn't discuss religion. You didn't discuss money, illness, or anyone's personal difficulties in any direct way. What you discussed was the social world itself, who had been seen where, who was leaving for the country, whether a certain dinner last Thursday had been well managed. You discussed the fabric of the world you shared. You reinforced it with every sentence, and in doing so you confirmed to both parties that the world was intact, that the relationship was intact, and that the afternoon had been well spent. The skill was not in having interesting things to say within those limits. The skill was in making the conversation feel interesting despite them. A hostess who could take a 20-minute exchange about the social world and leave her caller feeling genuinely stimulated, as though something real had been exchanged, something worth carrying home, was a hostess whose afternoons people looked forward to. Her card tray filled. Her social position strengthened. Her afternoons acquired a reputation that brought better callers, which improved the quality of the social intelligence she received, which made the next season's management of the whole system easier. It was a compound interest calculation, conducted in conversation rather than in currency, and the women who understood this were better at it than the system that contained them had any right to expect. The occasional caller who pushed against the conversational limits was a management problem. A woman who wanted to discuss the Boer War, or a scandalous novel, or the correct position on Home Rule, and there were such women, required careful steering, not dismissal, not encouragement, steering. You absorbed the energy of what she wanted to talk about. You validated her seriousness without endorsing the breach of convention, and you redirected the conversation back toward its proper territory without her quite noticing that you'd done it. This was not a small skill. It was the skill of a diplomat conducting a negotiation in a room where the negotiation could not be acknowledged to be happening. You have done something like this. The conversation you redirected so smoothly that the other person never knew there had been a redirect. The subject you closed before it opened, so gently that it felt like a natural pause. The drawing room was full of these moves, and the woman in the centre of it was making them all afternoon, continuously, without ever stopping to take notes. The fire crackles. Outside, the light is the particular pale gold of a London afternoon in late autumn. You can hear the sound of a cab passing on the street below. The clock on the mantelpiece says 3:15. You're still here. And so is the next caller, somewhere on the pavement outside, making her way to your door. The next caller will arrive soon. And what she carries, that small engraved rectangle of card, is the key to a social system more elaborate, more precise, and more genuinely consequential than anything the men at the club have invented this afternoon. You'll understand it better in a moment, but first you need to see the other side of it. She is not at home. 3 words, and every one of them a choice. The not at home was one of the great social fictions of the Edwardian era, and it was a fiction that everyone understood and nobody acknowledged. It did not mean the lady of the house was absent. It meant she was not receiving. She might be sitting 20 feet away, reading a novel or writing letters, or simply choosing not to be seen today. And the maid's delivery of those 3 words was not a lie. It was a convention, and conventions, in this world, had the weight of law. You could not be offended by a not at home. It would be deeply bad form to express even a flicker of disappointment. You handed your card to the maid, thanked her, and left. You returned to your own world, and you made a mental note, because this was information. The question was only what kind. If you'd been not at home twice in a row, that meant something different from once. 3 times in a row was a message so clear that even the most oblivious caller could read it. And the most significant aspect of all of this was that nothing explicit ever needed to be said. No confrontation, no explanation, no scene. The social world of Edwardian England was run, to a considerable degree, on the currency of implication, and the women in those drawing rooms were its most fluent speakers. This was the world you inhabited for those 3 afternoon hours, and it was by any measure a world you ran. What you didn't run, what sat on the hall table between those hours like the record of a parallel life, was the card tray, and the card tray deserves its own time. Because the calling card was not merely a piece of paper with a name on it. It was a document. It was a signal. It was, in the hands of someone who understood it, a finely calibrated instrument of social intention, and the women who used it understood it with a fluency and a precision that I suspect most of us would find genuinely surprising. That is exactly where we're going next. But before we get there, a moment to sit inside this drawing room a little longer, because there's one more piece of this opening section that deserves its due, and it's the piece that quietly underpins everything else. You have, by this point in the afternoon, received perhaps 3 or 4 callers, each one announced by the maid, each one ushered in for their 20 minutes, each one offered tea, offered conversation, offered the careful warmth of a hostess who's been trained since girlhood to perform this role with apparent effortlessness, and it is effortful. That is the thing nobody says. The Edwardian concept of the accomplished woman did not include the word performance, but performance was precisely what it was. You sat in a room and you made people feel welcomed and at ease for 20 minutes at a stretch, multiple times over the course of an afternoon, without allowing any fatigue to register on your face. You were expected to remember the name of someone's daughter, who had been mentioned once at a dinner 6 months ago. You were expected to know, approximately, the current state of a dozen social relationships that were not your own. You were expected to listen, genuinely, attentively, without appearing to store any of it, and then to recall it perfectly when it became useful. The woman who did this well was described as charming. It did not occur to anyone to describe her as skilled. The education that produced this skill was itself a subject of considerable social investment. A girl of the upper middle class in the 1880s and 1890s, the woman who would be running her drawing room in 1907, was educated in most cases at home, not by her mother, or not only by her mother, but by a governess. The governess was a figure of some social pathos, a woman of good family who'd been reduced by circumstance to the position of educated employee. She was more educated than the cook, and better spoken than the housemaid, but she ate alone, socialized with neither family nor servants, and occupied a social position that had no comfortable name. What the governess taught was not what we would now call an academic curriculum. She taught French, conversational French, the kind that was useful at dinner tables and in European travel. She taught piano to a level that was appropriate for drawing-room performance, but not professional ambition. She taught watercolour painting, needlework, and the rudiments of household management. She taught how to write a letter correctly, what tone to use, how to address an envelope, which forms of salutation were appropriate for which categories of correspondent. You might be thinking, that is not very much, and measured against the education her brothers were receiving, Latin, Greek, mathematics, natural philosophy, history, debate, it was, in purely academic terms, less comprehensive. But measured against what it was preparing her to do, it was precisely calibrated. The French was for the dinner table, the piano was for the drawing room, the letter writing was for the correspondence, the household management rudiments were for the morning consultation. Each piece of the curriculum was a tool for the specific work she was being prepared to do. The work was the room, and the room required constant maintenance. By the time she was in her 30s, a woman who had run a household for a decade had accumulated a working knowledge that no curriculum could have fully prepared her for. She knew the particular sensitivities of her cook, the reliable competence of her housekeeper, the social calibrations required to maintain relationships with 40 different households simultaneously. She knew which of her husband's colleagues were useful to cultivate and which were best managed at a polite distance. She knew, with the particular precision of someone who has spent years reading a room, exactly which conversations would produce which results. The governess had not taught her any of this. The governess had given her the tools. The decade of practice had given her the skill, and the skill, like the work it served, went entirely unnamed. Outside, the autumn light is still holding. There are 2 more hours of it before the dusk arrives, and the gas lamps are lit. You're still in the drawing room. The next caller will be here in 15 minutes. The fire in the drawing room has burned down a little. Outside, the autumn light has shifted toward gold. Somewhere in the house below you, the kitchen has begun the slow work of preparing dinner. You can just detect the faint smell of something on the stove. Rich, warm, distant. The last caller has gone. The maid has cleared away the tea things. And on the hall table, the card tray holds the day's collection, a small fanned arrangement of paper and engraving that represents, if you know how to read it, the entire social intelligence of your afternoon. You know how to read it. You've known how to read it for years. And that is where we are going now. The calling card was, in physical terms, a modest object. A rectangle of stiff white cardstock, roughly the size of a modern business card for a gentleman, and slightly larger, about the size of a playing card for a lady. The size differential was not accidental. Nothing in the etiquette of this era was accidental. The lady's card was larger because a lady's social territory was, in this particular arena, considered greater. She received. She managed the household social calendar. She was the primary operator of the calling system. Her card needed more room. The printing on the card was engraved, not printed. Engraving left a slightly raised impression you could feel with your fingertip, and you would feel it, because the quality of the engraving was one of the first things a recipient noticed. A card that was merely printed rather than engraved was a subtle but readable signal. It said something. It said that the sender either did not know or did not care about the standard, and both possibilities reflected poorly on them. Your name appeared in the centre of the card. Just your name, correctly styled. A married woman used her husband's name, Mrs. Edward Hartley, not Mrs. Catherine Hartley. The form mattered because the form told the recipient precisely who you were in relation to the social world, not as an individual, but as a unit of a household and a marriage. Your identity on that card was a relational one. This is the part that tends to stay with people when they hear it. Not because it's shocking. The era's attitude to women's legal identity was what it was, but because the card is such a small, concrete object, you could hold it in your hand, and holding it, you could understand in miniature exactly what position a woman occupied in this world. Her name, her husband's name, her address, nothing else. That was the sum of what she was allowed to present to the social world on 2 inches of cardstock, and yet, what she did with that card was entirely her own. The folded corner was the first thing most people learned, and it's worth understanding correctly. Different corners of the card, folded down, communicated different things. A card left by folding one corner indicated that the caller had delivered it in person, rather than sending a servant. This mattered. Sending your card by servant was perfectly acceptable. But coming yourself, walking up the front steps, handing the card to the maid with your own gloved hand, was a statement of personal regard. It said, "I thought of you enough to come myself, Some households had their own variations on what each corner meant, but the underlying grammar was consistent. The fold was a way of adding meaning to a document that had almost no space for words. The card itself rarely had words on it beyond the name and address, but it didn't need them, because the card moved through the social world as part of a system of exchange that everyone who participated in it understood with great fluency, and the system had rules precise enough to govern every possible situation, including the ones most likely to cause social difficulty. Here is one. If you called on someone and they were not at home, you left your card with the maid. Standard. But if the household then failed to return your card within a reasonable period, to send their own card to your address, acknowledging the call, that was a signal, a clear one. It meant the acquaintance was not being pursued. No one said so. No letter arrived explaining the position. The card simply did not come, and you were expected to understand. And here is a second one, even more precise. If they did return your card, but sent it in a sealed envelope rather than handing it to your servant at the door, that was the nuclear option. An envelope. A sealed envelope containing a card was an act of extraordinary quiet social violence. It meant, I am returning this communication, but I wish to make no personal gesture in doing so. I am meeting the minimum requirement of courtesy and nothing more. It was the equivalent, in the language of this world, of a door being very gently, very deliberately closed. You have never, in your adult life, needed to send a sealed envelope. You understand what it would mean, and you hope, with some feeling, that you never do. The tray on the hall table holds 4 cards from this afternoon. You lift them one by one, reading each name, reading each card for what it says and what it doesn't. One has a folded corner, a personal visit, not a servant's delivery. That's worth noting. One is from a name you recognize as new to the neighborhood, recently arrived, making their first calls, standard, expected. You'll return it within the week. 2 of them are from women you know well, and one, the one you set aside with some care, placing it slightly apart from the others, is from a woman whose card you did not expect to receive today. You set it down. You look at it for a moment. The name in the center, engraved in that slightly raised script. Tomorrow, you'll decide what to send back. Tonight, there's dinner to manage. And after dinner, the evening. And somewhere across London, at this precise moment, your husband is at his club, in a leather chair, a glass nearby, surrounded by men who are doing something he finds important. You wonder, sometimes, if he knows that you are running anything at all. The answer, almost certainly, is no. But you have long since made your peace with that. The world runs on certain arrangements. You inhabit one of them, and inside its constraints, you have built something real. But that has always been the arrangement, hasn't it? And the arrangement, for all its constraints, had a logic of its own. What happened in those drawing rooms, what the women who occupied them built and maintained and managed, was not simply social nicety. It was a structure. It was a system that ordered the entire upper layer of English society, governed access to opportunity, shaped marriages and careers and fortunes, and ran on almost entirely female labour and almost entirely female intelligence. The men who benefited from it often could not have described it. They knew only that invitations arrived, that dinner parties were well organised, that the right people were somehow always in the right rooms at the right times. The women knew how, and if you had been one of them, you would have known too. And now, of course, the women wanted rooms of their own, not drawing rooms. They already had those. Not the husband's study, which was his territory and remained so. something different, something that was neither domestic nor borrowed. A room in a building with a name and a membership list, and a door that swung open for women, and, very specifically, not for men. If the calling card was the instrument of the domestic social world, what came next was its architectural equivalent, and it was, when you look at it clearly, one of the more quietly radical inventions of the Edwardian era. A club, not a gentleman's club, something built on the same bones, performing many of the same functions, and occupying precisely the spaces in the city that the gentlemen's clubs had never thought to claim. A place where a woman could eat lunch without explanation, could hold a meeting without a chaperone, could sit in a reading chair with a newspaper and not be looked at as though she'd made a mistake. The first of these places was already 20 years old by 1907, and what happened inside it would genuinely surprise you. But first, back to the card and back to the mechanism, because there are two more pieces of this system that haven't been said, and they are the ones that make the whole thing click into place. The first is the cut direct, not a metaphor, an actual thing with a name that was understood by everyone who participated in this world. Imagine you're walking along a street, Bond Street say, on a Tuesday morning that is actually afternoon, and you see someone you know, someone you've called on, someone who has called on you. Ordinarily, you would acknowledge each other, a nod, a brief pause, a word. This was the expected exchange. This was the grammar of public life. The cut direct was when you saw that person and looked straight through them, not away, through. You continued walking. Your gaze did not register their presence. They ceased, for the length of that exchange, to exist. Think about what that costs. You've been seen in London at a party in a shop, you've acknowledged someone, and the next time you appear on the same pavement, they walk through you like smoke. You carry that, you carry it home, and you do not speak of it. This was considered the most devastating social act available. Not a scandal, not a confrontation, not a letter, simply looking at someone as though they were made of air. And because this world ran on acknowledgement, because being seen was the currency, to be unseen was to be erased. The person who had just been cut walked on, knowing their position had shifted, that connection was gone, and that anyone who had observed it knew the same. You've probably never been cut. Most people haven't. But you know what it would feel like. It happened publicly. That was the point. The cut only counted if it was witnessed. There was also the matter of who could cut whom. Cutting up, delivering the cut to someone of a higher social rank, was simply not done. It was presumptuous. The cut only flowed downward or sideways. A duchess could cut anyone she chose. A new arrival to the neighbourhood cut no one without considerable social risk. The hierarchy of the gesture mapped exactly onto the hierarchy of the social world it policed, which tells you, if you were in any doubt, precisely what the social world was for. The newcomer's situation deserves a moment of its own, because arriving new to a neighbourhood, or new to the London season, placed a woman in a particular kind of trap, and it is a trap elegant enough to be almost admirable. In England, it was the established resident who called first on the newcomer, not the other way around. The newcomer did not call on anyone until that first call had been made. If you arrived in a new neighbourhood and began calling on the existing residents without waiting for their initiative, you were marking yourself as presumptuous, as someone who did not understand the rules, which was almost worse than someone who understood and chose to break them. So you waited. You settled into your house. You registered your presence through the small signals available to you. And you waited for the first card to arrive. If it didn't come, if the established residents chose not to call, you were simply not admitted. There was no mechanism to force the issue, no petition, no appeal. You could live in the same street as someone for a year and be invisible to their social world for the entire duration, and not a single rule would be broken. The decision had simply been made, and made silently, and made without recourse. This is not, it should be said, a system that looks terribly kind from the outside. And it wasn't. But it was a system that women ran. Entirely. The men of the neighbourhood were not the ones making these decisions. The men were at their clubs. The women held the gate, and they decided every day in dozens of small and precise ways who was inside and who was not. The card itself had a grammar. Not a written grammar, nothing so vulgar as a manual, a grammar of gestures understood by everyone who operated within the system and invisible to everyone outside it. The folded corner was the most eloquent of these gestures. When a caller delivered a card in person, rather than sending it by a servant, she folded the upper right corner down before handing it over. This fold meant I was here myself. I did not delegate this visit to a footman. I considered this call important enough to make personally. The receiving household understood from that fold that the relationship was being treated with a specific weight of intention. Different corners in some households carried different meanings. The lower right corner folded meant a card delivered on behalf of all the women in the caller's family. The upper left corner meant a condolence call, that the card was being left in acknowledgement of a bereavement rather than as a social visit. These conventions were not universal. They varied by family, by neighbourhood, by the conventions of whoever had established the household's particular idiom of card etiquette. You learned the local grammar the way you learned any grammar, by immersion, by observation, by the occasional social error that was gently corrected by someone who wished you well. You learned it because getting it wrong mattered. The card sent at the wrong moment, or folded in the wrong way, or returned too quickly or not quickly enough. Each of these could carry an implication that the sender had not intended. The speed of the return was particularly significant. Returning a card too quickly, as within hours of receiving it, suggested eagerness, which was socially undignified. Returning it too slowly, more than a week, suggested indifference, which was insulting. The ideal window was 2 to 3 days. Enough time to signal that you'd considered the matter, not so much time as to suggest the card had sat in the tray without attention. The card sent in a sealed envelope was a different matter entirely. An unsealed card handed to the maid was a normal social call. A card sent in a sealed envelope was a message that could not be read by the servant who delivered it, which was sometimes the point. It signalled private correspondence conducted under the cover of social form. But a sealed envelope in the context of a return card, sent back to a household that had called on you, carried a very different implication. It was the formal snub. The acknowledgement that the card had been received and the relationship that it represented was being returned unopened, at the level of the envelope. You have sent me a card. I am sending it back. We are done. This was rarer than the cut direct. It required more deliberate action. You had to go to the effort of an envelope and a servant's errand. But its meaning was unmistakable, and once it was sent, it could not be unsent. The social world of Edwardian London ran on the careful management of implication. This was implication at its most explicit. You are holding the gate right now. You are the one who decides. The tray on the hall table was not decorative. It was a record. It was a ledger. And the woman who kept it was the keeper of something real, Now, there is one more thing the card could tell you that we haven't touched on yet. The tray itself set in the entrance hall, visible to every visitor who arrived and handed their own card to the maid. The arrangement of cards on that tray was not random. It was curated. The cards of the most prestigious or influential visitors were placed on top, where subsequent callers would see them. This was not subtle. It was not meant to be subtle. The tray said to anyone who glanced at it on the way upstairs, "These are the people who have been here. This is the company this household keeps. You've arranged yours with some care. A card from a duchess, a card from a cabinet minister's wife, a card from someone whose name appeared in the court circular last week. These are assets. They are displayed. And the woman who can arrange her hall tray with even one such card has something no amount of money alone can buy. Evidence that the right people have already decided she's worth visiting. You understand this. You've always understood it. The card tray was, in a very direct sense, the Edwardian version of a social media profile, and the most followed accounts, then as now, were the ones where impressive people had already left their mark. I find this genuinely interesting. Not the vanity of it, which is obvious, but the intelligence of it. The system was imperfect and often cruel, and entirely closed to anyone outside a very narrow circle. And it was also, on its own terms, one of the most elaborately engineered social mechanisms ever devised. The women who operated it didn't build it. They were born into it. But they ran it with a sophistication that deserves acknowledgement, even now, even from this distance. The afternoon light through the drawing-room window has gone from gold to grey. It's past 5. The at-home hours are over. The card tray is full, and you know what each card means. Tomorrow the social world begins again. But tonight, you close the drawing-room door. The fire is settling into embers. Somewhere else in London, a different kind of room is still lit. Not a drawing room, not a domestic space wearing the clothes of hospitality. A room built for women who wanted something the drawing room could never quite give them. A room with a membership list, a dining room, a reading corner, and, in at least one notable case, a life stock market ticker that rattled quietly in the corner while the ladies had their lunch. You've heard of these places. You may even have considered one. A room of their own. The gentlemen's clubs of St. James's and Pall Mall are, by 1907, one of the great institutions of English life. They're old, many of them. The Athenaeum was founded in 1824, the Reform in 1836, the Garrick in 1831. You would know the names. You would recognise the buildings, those large pale facades on the south side of Pall Mall, the windows thick and quiet. If you passed them on a walk, you'd know without being told that you were not invited in. They provide their members with a library, a dining room, a smoking room, a billiard room, a reading room stocked with newspapers from across the country, and, in the better ones, bedrooms for members who have no particular desire to go home. That last detail is worth a pause. The clubs provided bedrooms, which means a man could, if he chose, exist almost entirely outside his domestic life. He could eat his meals at the club, sleep at the club, read at the club, meet everyone he needed to meet at the club. The wife at home, managing the household and the children and the social calendar, was not theoretically necessary to his daily survival. The clubs were, in this sense, a complete alternative world, and they'd been male only since their founding, not exclusively male by law in most cases. There was no Act of Parliament, simply male by convention, by rule, by the understanding that this was how things were and how they would remain. The Athenaeum, for instance, would not admit women as members until 2001. You're not misreading that. 2001. The debate had been ongoing, with various votes and various rejections, for the better part of 17 years before it was finally settled. The Club of the Mind, home to scientists, writers, clergymen of distinction, men of letters, required 17 years of internal argument to decide that women might also have minds worth accommodating, which, as institutional decision-making processes go, was not especially swift. Imagine sitting in 1907 and being told you would need to wait another 94 years. You might reasonably decide not to wait at all, and that, as it happens, is exactly what the women of 1907 decided. The first women's clubs emerged in the 1880s, before the Edwardian era, before King Edward had even become King Edward, and by the turn of the century they were a fixture of London social life. Not as well known as the gentlemen's clubs, not as architecturally grand as a rule, but real, functioning, full of members who had decided that if the existing rooms wouldn't open their doors, new rooms would simply have to be built. If you had been one of those women, if you had the right name, the right connections, the right year of birth, you might have been one of them. You might have sat in one of those rooms. You might have been exactly the kind of person they were built for, and the most exclusive of them, the one that set the standard for what a ladies' club could be, the one that turned away even royalty when royalty forgot the rules, was the Alexandra Club. Founded in 1884 and located at 12 Grosvenor Street, Mayfair, the Alexandra Club was not a place for every woman in London. It was a place for a very specific kind of woman. Membership was restricted to those who were eligible to attend the Queen's drawing rooms, meaning women of the aristocracy and upper gentry, women whose social credentials had already been assessed and confirmed by the most formal mechanisms the British establishment possessed. If you were eligible for a drawing room, you might apply. If you were not, the door was not for you. This exclusivity was, it should be said, entirely deliberate. The Alexandra Club was not trying to be democratic. It was trying to be the feminine equivalent of the most prestigious gentlemen's club in London, and it understood that prestige required scarcity. You cannot have everyone. That is the point. What it offered, inside that deliberate exclusivity, was something quite remarkable for its time. A space in the heart of Mayfair where women of the higher social rank could eat, meet, converse, and exist, entirely without men, entirely without the requirement to be hostessing or guesting or performing the role the domestic world demanded. They could simply be there, in a room, without explanation. Can you feel the difference? A room where nothing is required of you except your presence. The story that best captures what the Alexandra Club was, and what it believed itself to be, involves the future King of England and a locked door. The Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, attempted at some point to visit his wife, Princess Alexandra, at the club that bore her name. The club turned him away. The Prince of Wales. Standing at the door of the Alexandra Club on Grosvenor Street, and the club, the members, the rules, the institution, said no. Not today. Not this building. This space is not for you. By most accounts, the prince found the whole thing tremendously amusing. He reportedly declared that the club was worthy of bearing his wife's name precisely because it had held its ground. Whether he found it quite as amusing in the actual moment standing at the door is perhaps a question we cannot fully answer. But the story was told and retold, and it told the world something important about what the Alexandra Club was. A place that applied its rules to everyone, including princes. Let that land for a moment. In a world where your husband's rank and position determined your own, where a woman's legal identity was bound so completely to her marriage that her name disappeared into his on a calling card, this was a room where the Prince of Wales was turned away at the door. Not because anyone disliked him, simply because he wasn't a member. The ladies had their rules too, and they kept them. Inside the Alexandra Club, once you had made it past the door, and it was a door that many tried and a door that decided for itself, the day had a particular texture. There was a dining room, there was a drawing room not entirely unlike the one you'd left at home, except that this one contained no husband's chair, no husband's papers on the side table, no sense of a male life that the room existed to accommodate. There was a reading room, there were afternoon teas, and the chance for conversation with women of equal rank and equal intelligence, without the obligation to smooth everything into the drawing-room register of carefully selected topics. And there was, it should be said, a very active competition for the tables near the window. You might think that women freed from the performance of the domestic drawing-room would have no interest in being seen. You would be wrong. The window seats at the Alexandra Club were prime social real estate. To sit there was to be visible from the street, to signal to the passing world that you were a member, that you were here, that you were at ease. The performance shifted, but it did not end. It was just a performance in a room the women had built themselves on terms they had set, and that was a different thing entirely. The Alexandra Club was, in a phrase, the conservative wing of the women's club movement, exclusive, aristocratic, designed to replicate the gentleman's club experience rather than challenge it. To be a member was not to reject the social world. It was to claim the best of it for yourself. The rules were the same rules. The hierarchy was the same hierarchy. The women who sat at those window tables were the same women whose calling cards were stacked highest in other women's hall trays across Mayfair. If you had been one of them, you would have understood the appeal perfectly. The world was the same. The room was yours. And the door, crucially the door, opened only for you. But London is a large city, and not every woman who wanted a room of her own wanted it to look quite like that. Not every woman, when given the choice, chose the window seat. Some chose the lectern. A few streets away, in spirit if not always in address, was the Pioneer Club, and the Pioneer Club was something else entirely. Founded in 1892 and housed for most of its early life near Victoria Street, the Pioneer Club was designed for exactly the kind of woman the Alexandra Club's membership committee might have looked at with a slightly raised eyebrow. It was open to any woman who supported the objects of the club. The objects included, among other things, the full development of women's capacities, intellectual, professional, political, all of them. The Pioneer Club held debates, open debates, on topics that the drawing-room world would have considered either scandalous or simply not discussable. Whether women should marry at all. Whether socialism offered a better framework for society than the existing one. Whether women deserved the vote, and on what terms and how soon, and what would happen if they didn't get it. These conversations were happening in a clubroom in London, led by women, argued by women, decided by the votes of women, while their husbands, some of their husbands, were at clubs nearby discussing, presumably, things of national importance. There is something genuinely funny about the geography of this if you let yourself see it. The Pioneer Club was not hiding. It was not underground. It was sitting in central London, in a building with a sign on it, conducting open meetings about whether the entire social and political order might need some revision. And the men of London, at their reform clubs and their athenaeums and their Grosvenor squares, were largely unaware of its existence, or chose to be, which is not quite the same thing. Imagine, if you will, walking past it, a building on a respectable street. Nothing about the exterior to alarm anyone. Inside, A room full of women deciding whether your world needs to change. The Pioneer Club was, by most accounts, tremendous fun. Its members called each other by surname. Miss and Mrs. were dropped within the walls of the club, on the principle that the titles were relational, and the women inside the room were there as individuals, not as daughters or wives. This sounds small. In 1892 it was not small at all. To call a woman by her surname only, the way one colleague might address another, the way men addressed men, was to perform in miniature a different version of the world, a version where women were peers, a version where your name was entirely your own. The membership included journalists, writers, artists, nurses, teachers, doctors, and, in increasing numbers as the Edwardian era wore on, political activists. The suffragettes found natural allies and meeting points in the Pioneer Club. The New Woman, that figure of contemporary fascination and frequent satirical caricature, was in many ways a Pioneer Club invention. She was the woman who had decided that the 3 hours of the afternoon were not, in fact, the limit of her ambitions. You would have read about her in the papers. You might have envied her. You might, quietly, have been her. And then there was the Grosvenor Crescent Club. The Grosvenor Crescent Club occupies a specific and rather delightful place in this history. By the turn of the century, by 1900 or thereabouts, it had installed both a telephone and a stock market ticker, a live stock market ticker, in a ladies' club, so that the members could track the movements of their financial investments over lunch. You need a moment with that. This is not a detail that fits the standard story about Edwardian women, the one about passive, domestically confined figures waiting for their husbands to return from the serious world. These women had investments. They were tracking them in real time, in a room without men, over what was, presumably, a perfectly decent meal. Picture yourself at that lunch, or rather picture it, because it belongs to you as much as to anyone who was there. The ticker rattling quietly in the corner, the conversation moving between the social and the financial, without any sense that these were separate categories. Your portfolio up or down. The waiter refilling your tea without comment. The ticker was not there for show. It was not a curiosity or an ornament. It was there because the women who were members of the Grosvenor Crescent Club had financial interests that required monitoring, and they were not willing to be without that information simply because they were at lunch. This is a level of financial engagement that many people in 2026 do not bother to maintain, and these women were doing it in 1900, in a club that most histories of the Edwardian era do not mention. If your standard mental image of an Edwardian woman involves a drawing room and an embroidery frame, the Grosvenor Crescent Club is asking you to revise it. The geography of all of this is worth understanding, because it was not accidental. The women's clubs of London position themselves very carefully, not in St James's, where the gentlemen's clubs clustered. That would have been too direct a challenge, and too exposed. Not in the residential squares, where domestic life would have clung to them. Instead, they gathered in the neighbourhood between Piccadilly and Oxford Street. Mayfair, Belgravia, the streets just north of Green Park. Close enough to the shopping streets to appear to a casual observer to be simply another amenity for women who had come up to town to spend their morning that was actually afternoon. Far enough from the corridors of male power to avoid direct confrontation. This was strategic. Whether it was consciously strategic or simply the result of practical decisions about where buildings were available and affordable, the effect was the same. The women's clubs occupied a space that looked, from the outside, like leisure. From the inside, it was something else. It was infrastructure. You could, by 1907, spend an entire day in London as a woman of the upper middle class and never go home until dinner. You could take the underground from your neighbourhood, arrive at your club, have breakfast in the dining room, attend a committee meeting, make a telephone call, check your investments on the ticker, have lunch with 3 women who are each doing something interesting with their afternoon, attend a lecture or a debate, have tea, and then make your way home. At no point would you have needed to be chaperoned. At no point would you have needed a male escort. At no point would you have been in a space that did not belong to you. Your husband spent his day at his club. You spent yours at yours. And the world he came home to, the well-managed household, the correctly arranged dinner table, the social calendar that somehow always had the right people in it, was the product of the 3 hours you'd spent before you left, and the decade of practice that had preceded them. He would not, in all probability, have known that you'd had a day at all. And perhaps, if you were the kind of woman who had found your way into one of these rooms that suited you perfectly, the women's club movement was not only a London phenomenon. That is one of the things its history tends to obscure. By 1910, women's clubs existed in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and Bristol. Some were fashioned on the model of the London clubs. Comfortable rooms, dining facilities, reading rooms. Others were more specifically functional, rooms associated with professional societies, with educational institutions, with political organisations. The Manchester Women's College had rooms that functioned in practice as a club for the women who studied and worked there. The Edinburgh Ladies' College offered similar facilities to its graduates. The lecture was the unit of intellectual currency in this world. The Women's Club of the Edwardian era organised lectures with a consistency and a range that is genuinely striking if you look at the records. The Pioneer Club invited speakers from law, medicine, philosophy, economics, and literature. The lectures were not purely academic. They were often directly political, connected to the questions of the day, the questions about what women were owed and what the legal and social structure was failing to deliver. A Pioneer Club evening could move from a lecture on the Married Women's Property Act to a discussion of the prison conditions being reported in the newspapers, to a debate about whether the movement should maintain its constitutional approach or align with the WSPU's militancy. These were not quiet conversations. The relationship between the women's clubs and the suffragette movement was complicated in the way that all relationships between institutional life and radical action tend to be complicated. The clubs provided a space for debate. They provided an educated, organised membership. They provided, in some cases, a network of women who had professional and social connections that the movement needed. But the clubs themselves were not, for the most part, formally aligned with any political organisation. They were spaces where the debate could happen. The decision about what to do with the conclusion of that debate was the individual member's own. This distinction mattered. A woman who was a member of the Alexandra Club and attended a Pioneer Club lecture and read the WSPU's newspaper was not necessarily a suffragette. She was a woman who was informed. She understood the argument. She had thought about it in a room with other women who were also thinking about it. What she did with that understanding was her own business, conducted privately, managed with the same discretion she brought to every other aspect of her social life. Many of these women did nothing that could be called activism. They voted when they finally could. They supported the charities they believed in. They ran their households and their clubs and their social networks with the intelligence that the system had carefully channeled into those spaces. And that too was a form of persistence. To be capable and to remain where you were, to keep the rooms running, to maintain the world, was also a kind of choice. It simply never got the credit that the more visible choices did. You're thinking about this, perhaps, in a way that connects to something in your own life, the way competence can be used, and the way it is not always used in the directions that its owner might have chosen if choosing had been simpler. But before the club, before the street, before any of it, there was the house, and the house had its own world entirely. The morning room was quiet now. The fire had been built up again for evening. In a few hours the dinner table would require your attention, the seating arrangement, the question of who sat nearest your husband and who was placed at a sufficient distance from the person they'd argued with at last month's garden party. There was, as always, something to manage. But the afternoon had been yours. That was the thing that nobody quite said, and that this history tends to miss entirely. The drawing room and the club, and the card tray and the social network they maintained, these were not the absence of a life. They were a life, a structured, demanding, socially complex, and often genuinely interesting life, conducted without recognition, without title, without in most cases a salary or a legal identity separate from the man who'd given you his name on a calling card. And yet, the household you returned to was real. The competence required to run it was real. The staff of 12 who moved through it invisibly, and the woman who managed their movements. She was real. The account books were real. The correspondence was real. The social intelligence required to keep 40 relationships in good repair simultaneously. That was real. And that, it turns out, is where we need to spend some time. Because the house itself, the thing that made all of this possible, the machine that sat beneath the drawing room and the card tray and the club membership, ran on a kind of labour that the history books have been remarkably reluctant to discuss. The house ran on people, and the people who ran it worked hours that would, by any modern standard, be considered extraordinary. Let's go below stairs for a moment. You won't have been there very often, but someone has. The scullery maid was typically the youngest person in the household, 16, sometimes younger, sometimes as young as 13, if the household was not particularly scrupulous. She was often the first person awake in the morning. 4:30 or 5 o'clock was standard. Her first task was to light the range in the kitchen, a coal range that needed raking out, relaying and kindling, before it would produce the heat required for the household's morning tea. You, of course, would not have known what that heat cost her. Before that tea was made, before the family stirred, before the kitchen maid began breakfast, and the lady's maid prepared the morning water, the scullery maid had already been at work for 2 hours in the cold. You, seeing the result, would not have imagined the effort. She would still be working at 10 or 11 at night, washing the dishes from dinner, scrubbing the pots the cook had used. In a household with a full dinner party, that meant cleaning dishes from a 5-course meal, then the serving dishes, then everything that had come up from the kitchen and gone back down again. She had no defined end to her day. She was done when the work was done. And she would be up again at 4:30 the following morning. You, dreaming of your tomorrow, would not have thought of her. You will not have met her. That was the point. Below stairs, on a dinner party day, the kitchen was organised with a precision that the drawing room upstairs only approximated. The cook was at her range by 7 in the morning. By 9, the first of the dinner's components was in preparation. A 5-course dinner for 12 required meat, fish, soup, removes, entrees, and a dessert. Each course had its own timing, its own temperature requirements, its own window of readiness. The cook managed all of these simultaneously, in a kitchen that had no refrigeration beyond the larder and the ice house, with a kitchen maid and a scullery maid as her workforce. The footman's day on a dinner party evening was governed by a different set of demands. He had been on duty since morning, answering the door, carrying coal, cleaning boots, performing the dozen invisible tasks that kept the house in motion. By 5 o'clock he was dressed for the evening, livery pressed, white gloves on, hair powdered if the household was formal enough to require it. He had been instructed and drilled in exactly what to do during the serving of dinner, which side to serve from, when to remove a plate, how to refill a glass without being asked and without being noticed. The art of the footman at the dinner table was the art of anticipation, knowing what would be needed before it was needed, and providing it silently in a way that made its provision invisible. You, at the dinner table, would experience this as seamlessness, as ease, as the particular luxurious quality of a well-run house. The footman had been standing for 8 hours by the time he placed the first course in front of you. You would not have known that either. The whole system was designed so that you wouldn't. This was the world beneath the drawing room, not a hidden world. It was very much there, very much present, the engine without which the social machine above could not have run for a single day. But it was structured to be invisible, and the woman who ran both the drawing room and the engine beneath it, the woman who managed the footman's training and the cook's kingdom and the scullery maid's early mornings, was managing more than anyone watching the afternoon calls would have known to look for. The invisibility of the domestic servant in an Edwardian household was not accidental. It was designed. The entire system was constructed so that the machinery of the house could not be detected. You, walking through the hall, would never know the gears beneath. Hot water appeared as if by itself. Fires burned as if they tended themselves. Clean clothes materialized in wardrobes overnight. The table was set before you entered the dining room, cleared before you re-entered it, and the interval between courses was managed by footmen drilled not to make eye contact. Your comfort, in other words, required their erasure. The lady of the house was not ignorant of this machinery. She was its director. She knew who had done what, and whether it had been done correctly, and what the consequence would be if it hadn't. The housekeeper was her deputy. The cook reported to her. In practice, this meant that the cook and the housekeeper maintained a relationship of careful mutual suspicion, and the lady of the house managed that arrangement with the same diplomatic precision she applied to everything else. The difference was that if this particular negotiation broke down, dinner would suffer, and the suffering would be visible to 12 guests. The butler managed the male staff, though his authority sat beneath hers within the house, and every morning, after the letters, she reviewed the accounts. Your accounts, your household, your decision. The household account books are one of the more underappreciated records of the Edwardian era. They exist in archives in considerable numbers. They're written in a woman's hand, almost always. They record expenditure on coal, on candles, on kitchen supplies, on linen, on wages, on the upkeep of rooms. They show, in the most concrete possible form, that the woman who kept them was performing financial management, budgeting, monitoring, adjusting, recording, as a matter of daily routine. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management was first published in 1861, and by the Edwardian era it was still the definitive reference for the domestic operation of a respectable household. It contained servant management advice, wage scales, recipes, cleaning schedules, instructions for laying a table and writing an invitation letter. It contained In other words, almost everything you needed to know to run a household of 12 people on a defined budget without any formal training in management whatsoever, which is precisely what most women who used it had. They had the book, they had the expectation, they had the model of their own mothers, and they simply got on with it. I find that quietly extraordinary if you think about it for a moment. The equivalent operation today would require an operations manager, a financial controller, an events coordinator, a chef, a facilities manager, and a human resources function. In an Edwardian household, all of those roles collapsed into one person, who also happened to be responsible for the social calendar, the correspondence, and the afternoon calls. She was never called any of those things. She was called a wife. The household she managed was a ranked institution with its own internal politics and its own very clear hierarchy. At the top of the servant structure below stairs was the butler, responsible for the male staff, the wine cellar, the silver, and the front door. Next was the housekeeper, responsible for the female staff, the linen cupboard, the household accounts on a daily level, and the running of everything that happened in the rooms that the family actually occupied. The lady of the house sat above both of them, not as a colleague, as the employer. You are the employer. It is worth sitting with that word for a moment. The morning consultation between the lady and the housekeeper was, in a well-run household, a precisely calibrated piece of management. It happened after the morning letters and before the lady was occupied with the day's social obligations. The housekeeper would arrive with the household accounts for the previous day, any complaints or requests from the staff, and a proposed menu for the cook to follow. The lady would review, approve, redirect, and instruct. This consultation lasted perhaps 20 minutes. In those 20 minutes, the decisions made about meals, expenditure, room management, and staff logistics would determine the functioning of the house for the next 24 hours. Mrs. Beeton was specific about wages. Her edition of 1861 listed a cook in a medium-sized household as earning between 18 and 30 guineas per year. A housemaid earned from 9 to 14 guineas. A scullery maid at the bottom of the household earned 6 to 9 guineas if she was lucky. These were annual figures. Divided by the working hours these women actually kept, they represent a rate of pay that would, by any modern calculation, be extraordinary in its smallness. The scullery maid working 14-hour days, 6.5 days per week, at 6 guineas per year was earning roughly a halfpenny per hour. That is not a wage. That is a rounding error. You will have noticed that Mrs. Beeton published her book in 1861. By the Edwardian era, wages had risen somewhat, but not dramatically. The domestic service economy was sustained by the limited alternatives available to women in the working class. Service provided food, accommodation, and a form of stability. It also provided, in a social world where respectability mattered enormously, the specific respectability of being in a good household. A cook in a household of 12 in Mayfair had a social status within the servant class that a factory worker could not match. The cook was a particularly interesting figure in the household hierarchy because the cook was the one servant over whom the lady's authority was most regularly tested. Cooks, especially good ones, were scarce and knew it. A cook who produced results was often permitted certain liberties that other servants were not. She had absolute sovereignty in her kitchen. The butler rarely entered it. The housekeeper entered by arrangement, and the lady herself was an occasional visitor at most. The cook's kingdom was the kitchen, and within it she was the queen. This created a dynamic that the household management literature of the era addresses with notable frequency. The difficulty of managing a person who was technically in your employ, but who held practically a power of supply that you could not easily circumvent. A bad cook produced dinners that reflected poorly on the household. A good cook who left took with her an irreplaceable institutional knowledge of the family's preferences, dietary requirements, and entertaining habits. You could advertise for a replacement and receive applications from women who had worked for other households and go through the whole elaborate process of character references and trial meals. Or you could maintain a working relationship with the cook you had. Many ladies chose the latter. They managed the relationship. They absorbed the small frictions and gave ground on certain kitchen decisions and expressed gratitude with some regularity. This was not weakness. It was management. The specific management skill of knowing when authority should be asserted and when it should be held in reserve. Your modern equivalent is probably somewhere in a meeting you attended last week. The colleague you needed too much to confront directly. The situation you navigated rather than resolved. The Edwardian lady was doing the same thing every day in her house, and she was doing it without any of the institutional vocabulary that we now have for it. No performance reviews, no HR processes, no clearly written job descriptions. Just the morning consultation, the wages, and the ongoing calculation of how much latitude was worth giving to keep the household running smoothly. The female staff were managed through the housekeeper, who was herself managed by the lady. This chain of delegation had advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was distance. The lady could make decisions without appearing to be directly in conflict with the lower servants, which maintained the social distance that the household's smooth functioning required. The disadvantage was information loss. What the scullery maid was actually doing at 4:30 in the morning was mediated through several layers of report before it reached the lady, and those layers could, and did, distort it. Staff conflicts were one of the recurring administrative challenges of the Edwardian household. A housemaid who was not getting along with the parlour maid. A footman whose conduct below stairs was creating tensions with the lady's maid. A cook who considered the kitchen maid too slow and had said so at length, in terms that the kitchen maid found demoralizing. These human problems arrived on the lady's desk, metaphorically, with some regularity. She resolved them or she didn't. If she didn't, they escalated until someone left, and then she had to replace them, which was its own particular burden. The character reference system added another layer of complexity. When a servant left your household, for any reason, you were expected to provide a written character reference. This document was the servant's primary means of obtaining their next position. A bad character killed a working career. A good character smoothed the transition. The lady was therefore at the point of departure a gatekeeper with significant power over someone who had, in many cases, spent years making her household function. She could be generous with this power or she could be precise with it. Most households tried to be fair, some were not. The servant had no recourse. You noticed that the power in these relationships was never quite equal, and never quite where it appeared to be on the surface. The emotional component of this work is the part that's hardest to quantify and easiest to overlook. Knowing who among your dinner guests disliked each other and placing them correctly at the table. Tracking which social relationships in your circle were currently warm, which were cooling, which were actively in distress and required careful management. Knowing when to invite someone and when to wait. Knowing which invitation to accept and which to decline in a way that didn't cause offence. These decisions required social intelligence of a very high order, the kind that can be studied but not fully taught, that accumulates over years of practice, and that produces results measurable in the warmth of a room and the ease of a conversation. Your grandmother understood this in some form, perhaps your mother. Perhaps you understand it too, in the smaller register of a modern life, the quiet work of maintaining a social world, of keeping the connections alive, of managing the feelings of the people around you without anyone acknowledging that managing is what you're doing. The Edwardian woman who ran this household was doing it at scale. She was doing it as a full-time occupation, and she was doing it inside a legal and social framework that gave her almost no formal recognition for any of it. If you had been her, you would have felt this every morning at the writing desk, and every evening at the dinner table, and in every conversation where what you had managed so carefully was assumed to have simply happened by itself. Let that settle for a moment. Then we'll go further. Before the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, the legal situation was starker still. Under the old common law doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. She ceased, upon marriage, to be a separate legal person. Any property she owned at marriage became his. Any wages she earned during the marriage were his. Any gift made to her was legally his to receive. She could not, on her own authority, sign a contract, bring a lawsuit, or own a lease. She was, in the eyes of the law, an extension of the man she had married, a legal accessory to his person. This applied to women who were, in practice, running complex domestic enterprises. It applied to women who were managing the social calendar, the household accounts, the servant wages, and the family's social reputation. It applied to women who were, in the judgment of anyone who spent time in their households, clearly the most capable administrator in the building. The law did not care. The law said, she is his. The 1882 Act changed this. But as anyone who has observed the distance between a legal change and a social change will recognize, the Act changed what the law permitted. It did not immediately change what people believed, or how they behaved, or what they expected. And the expectation, in the Edwardian period, was still substantially shaped by the older reality. A woman might now legally own her property, but the social world in which she operated had been built on the assumption that she didn't. The clubs her husband belonged to excluded her. The professional institutions that would have given her work a name excluded her. The universities had until recently refused her degrees. The franchise excluded her entirely. Her property rights had been restored. Everything else was still in negotiation. This is the paradox at the centre of the Edwardian lady's life. She was an intelligent, capable, often very well-educated woman, managing a complex domestic and social enterprise in a world that had recently decided she could legally own things, but had not yet decided that the things she did were worth naming. Her competence was visible every day in the functioning of her household and the smooth operation of her social network. Its invisibility was not accidental. The social contract of the period actively required that this competence appear effortless, unschooled, and instinctive, because the alternative, acknowledging that it was skilled labour, would have destabilised the entire fiction that the world of serious work was the world of men. If you find this frustrating to read, that is the correct response. It was designed to be invisible, and it worked. The histories of the Edwardian period spent most of the 20th century talking about the men who were at their clubs, while their wives were, apparently, simply at home. It has taken a very long time for anyone to notice how much was happening in the drawing room. Your competence was real. Your authority was partial. That was the arrangement. There is something in this that is worth sitting with. Not with distress, with a kind of clear-eyed recognition. These were capable women, operating complex systems inside a framework that refused to call what they did by any name that acknowledged its complexity. The capability was real. The system was real. The erasure of it was also real. If you have ever done work that went unnamed, you know something of this. And outside the house, beyond the card tray, beyond the account books, beyond the morning consultation and the afternoon call, something was beginning to change. Not in a dramatic way, not yet, not with confrontation or legislation, or the kind of visible rupture that tends to get written into history books, but in the quiet and specifically commercial way that the Edwardian era often preferred for its revolutions. A building had opened on Oxford Street. It had opened on the 15th of March, 1909, a Monday morning. Harry Gordon Selfridge, American-born retail innovator, had spent the better part of 2 years planning it. He had taken out full-page advertisements in every major London newspaper. He had decorated the windows on Oxford Street in a way that had not been seen before. Theatrical, vivid, designed to stop a person on the pavement and hold them there. He had invited the public, and on the 15th of March, 1909, approximately 90,000 people came through the doors of Selfridge's on Oxford Street in a single day. You would have been one of the curious. You would have gone. Think about what 90,000 people filing through one building looks like. It was the largest department store in Europe, and it was, from the beginning, designed with women specifically in mind. Not in the sense that women were its primary customers. They were, but this was not the radical part. The radical part was what Selfridge offered them inside. You could enter the store without intending to buy anything. You could browse without being followed by an assistant asking if you needed help. You could spend an hour at the perfume counter and leave with nothing, and no one would make you feel that you had done something wrong. This sounds entirely ordinary to you today. In 1909, it was genuinely new. Most shops, before Selfridge's, were spaces you entered with a specific purchase in mind and left as soon as you had made it. Browsing was a concept Selfridge imported from America, where the culture around retail has developed differently, and it changed almost immediately the nature of what it meant for a woman to be in a public space, because Selfridge's also gave women somewhere to be. The store included a restaurant, a tea room, a reading room, a hair salon, a library, and crucially, the detail that sounds small and was anything but, public women's restrooms. The first public women's restrooms in a London department store. This is what the restrooms meant in practical terms. A woman could now leave her house in the morning and not return until the afternoon or the evening without needing access to a private house to manage the basic requirements of being a person in a body. Before Selfridge's, a woman who spent a full day in public in central London required at some point the hospitality of a friend's house, a hotel she was a guest of, or a club she was a member of. The alternatives were limited. The implication was clear. A woman who spent the whole day in public was either very well connected or she was the wrong kind of woman. Selfridge's changed that. It said, in architectural terms, you may be here. You are expected to be here. There are rooms for you. There is no moment at which your being here requires justification. And women came, not just to shop, to be in a room that said that. The cultural moment that Selfridge's represents is sometimes reduced, in histories of the period, to a shopping story, a luxury goods story, a story about how women became consumers. But that is not quite the right frame. The right frame is public space. What Selfridge's did was expand the geography of where a woman could legitimately spend her day, and geography in this world was not a neutral thing. Where you were permitted to be was a precise indicator of who you were permitted to be. Before Selfridge's, the legitimate public geography for an upper-class Edwardian woman was fairly circumscribed. Her own house, other people's houses, the park with suitable company, church, the shops briefly and purposefully. Her club, if she had one. The theatre, properly escorted. This was not nothing, but it was a defined territory, and the definition had, until recently, been policed fairly effectively by the social expectation of the chaperone. The chaperone was, in many cases, a family relation, an aunt, a mother, an older sister. In households without a convenient relation, she might be a paid companion, a woman of genteel poverty and appropriate age who was employed specifically to provide the social cover that allowed a younger woman to move through the world without attracting the kind of attention that an unchaperoned woman automatically attracted. The paid companion was another figure of considerable social pathos, occupying the same in-between territory as the governess, too educated and too well-spoken for the servants' hall, too dependent and too employed for the family table. She ate with the family and was introduced to guests as a friend, and everyone in the room understood that she was not quite either. Her function was to make certain things possible that would otherwise be impossible. A young woman could attend a concert unchaperoned only if the concert was a matinee, and she was with female companions of good standing. She could visit a friend's house without a chaperone if the friend's mother was in residence. She could not, under any ordinary social convention, be alone with a man to whom she was not related, not in a drawing room, not in a carriage, not at a social occasion where the gathering was small. The rules were not written down anywhere. They were understood by everyone and observed with a consistency that had the force of law without any of its mechanisms. The rules had no mercy. Why did the chaperone begin to decline? Not because the rules changed, not because someone decided the rules were wrong, but because the physical world changed around the rules, and the rules had not anticipated the changes. The Underground Railway created an enclosed semi-public space that the old framework had no category for. A woman in a train compartment was not quite in public and not quite in private. She was in transit. The underground smelled of coal and iron and the damp wool of winter coats. Who chaperoned her transit? The question had no good answer, and the practical response was that gradually, women stopped expecting one. The bicycle was worse from the chaperone's perspective. You cannot chaperone someone on a bicycle. The physics of it make the arrangement impossible, and yet the woman on the bicycle was unambiguously alone in public, going somewhere she had decided to go, at a speed that made surveillance impractical. By 1907, the chaperone still existed, especially for unmarried women, especially for formal occasions, especially in the more conservative households. But the edges of her authority had been eroded, not by argument, but by circumstance. The world had moved. The convention had not moved quite fast enough to keep up. And in that gap, between where the convention said a woman should be and where the practical world now allowed her to be, the Edwardian woman had found and was steadily occupying a great deal of new territory. You are, in your own life, the inheritor of that occupation. Every time you are somewhere without needing to explain your right to be there, you're in a space that was argued for and then simply taken by the women of this period. They didn't always win the argument. Sometimes they just went anyway, and the world caught up with them later. The chaperone is another Edwardian institution that history tends to treat as either charming or absurd depending on how the historian is feeling about the period. Its practical purpose was to ensure that an unmarried woman was never alone in public with a man to whom she was not related. Its social purpose was to signal that she was under appropriate supervision. that her virtue was intact and her reputation protected, and that no one needed to worry. You will notice that the chaperone was entirely for the benefit of other people's worries rather than her own. By 1907, the chaperone was already beginning to erode, not dramatically, not all at once. But the combination of the bicycle, the club, and the department store had collectively produced a version of female public life that did not quite fit the old framework. You could cycle to your club. You could spend an afternoon at Selfridge's unescorted. You could take the underground. These were not individually radical acts, but the accumulation of them was quietly revolutionary. The bicycle deserves a specific mention. It deserves more than it typically gets in this history. When the safety bicycle, the modern design with two equal-sized wheels, became widely available in the 1880s and 1890s, its adoption by women was almost immediate and almost universally opposed by people who felt strongly about the correct behaviour of women. The objections were numerous. Women who cycled would damage their reproductive health. Women who cycled would adopt unladylike postures. Women who cycled would be seen in public alone and in motion, which was. The critic seemed unable to quite articulate why this was a problem, but it clearly was. Women in motion, unchaperoned, going somewhere they had decided to go themselves. Your great-great-grandmother may have had a bicycle. She may have learned to ride it in a park, at a time when cycling by women was still considered a minor social scandal. She may have found, as many women found, that the experience of independent movement, of going exactly where she wanted to go at a speed she determined herself, was not easily surrendered. The bicycle gave women a mobility that the social world had not quite planned for, and they did not give it back. There is something in that for you too if you let yourself feel it. The simple fact of going where you want. The simple fact of not needing permission. The streets of London by 1907 contained women doing things that would have been, a generation earlier, essentially invisible. Women alone on bicycles. Women entering department stores without companions. Women getting on and off the underground, going places, carrying bags, arriving at clubs, attending meetings. The street itself had changed, or rather, the woman's relationship to the street had changed. She was no longer a passage-through-it figure, she was a resident of it, and you, tonight, wherever you are a resident of your world. You got here, you went where you chose. Selfridge's, as a physical space, was designed with a very specific philosophy about what a woman needed in order to be in public comfortably for a full day. Harry Gordon Selfridge had studied retail in America, where the culture around shopping had developed along different lines from the English tradition. In the United States, the department store was already understood as a destination, a place you went to spend time, not merely to acquire goods. Selfridge imported this understanding and applied it to a London market that was, in many respects, ready for it. The ground floor of Selfridge's was open and navigable. The cosmetics and perfume counters were positioned to draw you in rather than intimidate you. The layout was designed so that you could move through the space without feeling channeled or supervised. This was a deliberate departure from the older model of English retail, where the shop assistant tracked your movements, and the implication was always that you were taking up space that belonged to commerce, rather than to you. The restaurant on the 4th floor seated several hundred people. The tea room was adjacent. The writing room, where a woman could sit and write letters using the store's stationery at no cost, was a specific amenity that signalled something very clear. You may stay here all day. This is your building. You do not need to justify your presence by the frequency of your purchases. You can feel what that meant if you've ever been somewhere that treated your presence as conditional. The Underground Railway was the other piece of this puzzle that tends to get overlooked. The London Underground had been operating since 1863, but its expansion in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods made it genuinely useful for a middle-class woman who wanted to move around the city independently. You could get on at Kensington or Bayswater, travel to Oxford Circus, arrive at Selfridge's or your club or a lecture, and return, all without a carriage, without a coachman, without a male companion, and without any of the social visibility that a carriage on the street would have entailed. The Underground was private in the way that public spaces rarely were. You sat in a compartment, you travelled, you arrived somewhere else. The women who were using the Underground in 1907 were not all of the same kind. That is another thing the standard account of Edwardian female life tends to obscure. The woman going to her club in Mayfair and the woman going to her factory shift in Bermondsey were using the same stations. They were walking the same streets. The geography of London was more shared than the social world that operated within it liked to pretend. The working woman, the shop girl, the typist, the telephone operator, the factory hand, had always been in the street. You would have passed her on the pavement without a second thought. Her presence there was not a new development. What was new in the Edwardian period was the increasing visibility of women from the middle and upper classes in those same streets, for reasons other than shopping. The territory that had previously belonged to the working woman by economic necessity was being entered, from above, by women entering it by choice. This convergence was not comfortable for everyone. The figure of the new woman, the educated, independent, publicly active woman who read Ibsen and rode bicycles and belonged to clubs and had opinions about the franchise, was a source of considerable anxiety in the periodical press of the 1890s and 1900s. Punch magazine ran dozens of cartoons about her. The medical literature produced studies suggesting that too much intellectual activity was damaging to female health. The social commentary of the period devoted significant energy to explaining why the new woman was either a problem to be solved or a passing fashion to be tolerated. She was neither. She was the future, and in 1907 she was buying things on the ground floor of Selfridge's and reading the stock ticker at the Grosvenor Crescent Club and cycling to meetings of the Pioneer Club, and doing all of it within a few hundred yards of the Gentlemen's Clubs of St. James's, where the men who wrote the articles about her were having lunch. And in another part of the city, in another kind of building entirely, something else was happening that would change the street more dramatically than any department store ever had. The Suffragette campaign, and the woman who illuminates it most precisely, the one whose story contains the entire Edwardian class system in miniature, is not the most famous name from that history. She's not Mrs. Pankhurst, who has her own story in her own monument. She's a woman named Constance Lytton, or, to give her the full title she was born with, Lady Constance Georgina Lytton. Her father was Robert Bulwer Lytton, the first Earl of Lytton. He had been the Viceroy of India from 1876 to 1880, the representative of Queen Victoria in the subcontinent, one of the most powerful positions the British Empire could offer a man. Her family was, in other words, not just aristocratic, it was at the very summit of the Edwardian social world. She had grown up in houses that would later become museums. She'd met the people whose names were carved into buildings, and she became a suffragette. Not reluctantly, not in a small way. She joined the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, Emmeline Pankhurst's organisation, the one that broke windows and chained women to railings and distributed pamphlets from the galleries of the House of Commons. She became, within the movement, a woman of genuine conviction and genuine presence. And in 1909 she was arrested, and in 1909 she was imprisoned. This is where the story becomes the thing you need to hear. When Lady Constance Lytton was recognised in prison, when the prison authorities understood who she was, which family she came from, which world she inhabited, her treatment changed. She was examined by a doctor. Her heart was found to be in a condition that required care. She was released on medical grounds. Hold that for a moment. You are a woman. You are in prison. And whether your body's protected depends entirely on whether the right people know your name. This happened while other women in the same prison, women without titles, women without fathers who had been viceroys, were being force-fed. Force-feeding was the prison's response to hunger strikes, a tube through the nose or throat, a process that was, by every medical account available, extraordinarily painful and physically damaging. These women were not being examined carefully by doctors. They were not being released on health grounds. They were being held and fed by force, because they had no title that made their bodies worth protecting. Their names were not the right names, and that for the British state in 1909 was the deciding factor. You know what that means. You can feel the weight of it. Lady Constance Lytton understood exactly what had happened. She understood it with a precision and an anger that her subsequent writing makes very clear, and she decided to test the hypothesis. In January 1910, she disguised herself. She cut her hair, she changed her clothes. She adopted a working-class accent and a working-class name, Jane Wharton, seamstress. She was arrested again at a suffragette demonstration in Liverpool, and as Jane Wharton, seamstress, she was treated as Jane Wharton, seamstress, would be treated. Hold that. She is in a prison cell. She has chosen to be there. She knows what is coming. She was not examined by a doctor. She was not released on medical grounds. She was force-fed 8 times. The force-feeding procedure, as it was practiced in British prisons during the suffragette campaign, was not a medical intervention in any meaningful sense. It was a punishment dressed in the language of care. 2 prison officers held the woman down, a doctor or a prison medical officer, whose relationship to the ordinary ethical standards of medicine was, in some cases, loose. Inserted a rubber or metal tube either through the nostril or through the mouth. Liquid food was then poured through the tube into the stomach. The process, if the woman resisted, and most of them did, caused damage to the throat, the nasal passages, and the stomach. The physical pain was considerable. The psychological effect was worse, far worse. Constance Lytton's account of it in Prisons and Prisoners is written with a restraint that makes it more devastating than any more emotional account would have been. She did not dramatize. She described. She gave the details of the procedure, the preparation, the physical mechanics, the immediate aftermath, with the same careful, observational prose she brought to every other aspect of her prison experience. And because she wrote with that restraint, the account was nearly impossible to dismiss. She had been there. She had been Jane Wharton, seamstress. She had experienced what Jane Wharton experienced, not as an observer, but as the person the tube was being inserted into. And she had come out the other side, a title restored, a story that the state could not plausibly deny, and a book deal. Prisons and Prisoners was not just a personal memoir. It was a documented argument. Constance structured it to make a specific case, that the prison system operated differently depending on the social class of the prisoner, that this differential treatment was not an accident or an administrative error, but a feature of the system, and that the state's treatment of imprisoned suffragettes was therefore not merely cruel, but specifically structurally unjust. The book included her account of the first imprisonment, when she was Lady Constance, and her account of the second when she was Jane Wharton. The contrast was the argument. She did not need to make it rhetorically. She simply laid the two accounts side by side and let the reader see what she had seen. You can do that still. Read the first account, then the second. The argument makes itself. You can still read this book. That is one of the quietly startling facts of its history. Published in 1914, it has remained in print, not continuously, but substantially, for over a century. It was not a sensational success on publication. The timing was difficult. The war began in August 1914, and public attention, which had been consumed by the suffragette campaign, shifted almost overnight to questions of national survival. The WSPU itself suspended its campaign at Emmeline Pankhurst's instruction. Constance Lytton's book arrived into a world that had, in the space of a summer, stopped arguing about women's suffrage and started arguing about the Western Front. But the book existed. It was read. It circulated in the networks of women who were paying attention, and it established, in permanent printed form, the evidence of the class distinction that the prison system had hoped would go undocumented. Lady Constance Lytton's great contribution to the suffragette campaign was not any act of protest she performed. It was the precision of her observation and the fact that she wrote it down. She suffered a stroke in 1912, 2 years before the book was published, while she was still in the process of writing it. The stroke was, in the view of those who knew her, a direct consequence of the physical damage sustained during the force feedings. She completed the book despite significantly impaired health, dictating sections when she could not write. That she finished it at all is an act of will that the calm, measured prose gives no indication of. You would not know, reading it, that it had been written by someone who had survived 8 forced feedings and a stroke. You would only know that it had been written by someone who had decided it needed to be written. When her identity was discovered, when the prison authorities realized that Jane Wharton was Lady Constance Lytton, there was by all accounts considerable alarm. She'd exposed in the most direct possible way that the protection extended to imprisoned suffragettes was not a matter of principle, it was a matter of class. The body of a woman with a title was a body worth protecting. The body of a seamstress was a body the state could do as it liked with. She wrote about it. The book is called Prisons and Prisoners. Published in 1914, it is still in print. It is one of the primary documents of the Edwardian suffragette campaign, and if you were to read it, if you were to sit with her account of the force feeding, the cold, the deliberate indignity of the prison regime, you would not easily reduce the suffragette movement to a story about broken windows and inconvenient women. You would understand it as what it was. A campaign by people who had decided that being treated as less than human was not something they were prepared to tolerate. You can feel the shape of that decision. The Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, had been founded by Emmeline Pankhurst in Manchester in 1903. By 1906 it had moved its headquarters to London and was operating with a militancy that separated it from the older, more constitutional wing of the suffragette movement. The WSPU's position was that peaceful argument had been tried for decades and had produced nothing. Parliament had been petitioned, letters had been written, meetings had been held. The argument had been won on the merits many times over, and nothing had changed. The conclusion the WSPU drew from this was that the argument was not the problem. The problem was the unwillingness of those with power to move, and so they moved to make staying still expensive. The window-smashing campaign of 1912 was one of the most carefully coordinated acts of civil disobedience the country had seen. On a single afternoon, in March, groups of suffragettes walked along the shopping streets of London's West End and systematically broke the windows of the shops, not randomly. Specific targets, specific streets, orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. The sound of it was glass, sheet after sheet of it, falling onto the pavement of Regent Street and Oxford Street in the March cold. The damage alone ran to several £1,000s. The police made arrests. The newspapers were outraged. The Home Secretary was beside himself. You might wonder, given the scale and coordination of this, what the movement's relationship was to the Edwardian ladies we've been discussing. The answer is more complicated than the standard story suggests. The WSPU membership was not exclusively working class. It included women of exactly the social position we've been tracing through this afternoon. Women with card trays and morning consultations and club memberships. Women who had in their drawing rooms the kind of social intelligence and organisational capacity that the WSPU found extremely useful. The Pankhurst family was solidly middle class. Christabel Pankhurst had a law degree from Victoria University of Manchester. She had passed with first-class honours and had then been refused the right to practice because she was a woman. This is the kind of detail that clarifies a great deal about the campaign. The government gave it an official title, the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act. Everyone else called it the Cat and Mouse Act of 1913. The nickname was more honest. It was the government's response to the hunger strikes. Rather than allowing imprisoned suffragettes to die in custody, which would create martyrs and a public relations catastrophe, the act allowed the government to release hunger-striking prisoners when their health deteriorated to a dangerous point, then rearrest them once they had recovered. The woman was released, she recovered, she was arrested again. The cycle could repeat indefinitely. In practice, it was an instrument of sustained physical destruction. A woman who was repeatedly arrested, repeatedly starved, repeatedly released, and repeatedly rearrested suffered cumulative damage to her health with each cycle. The government was not creating martyrs, it was creating invalids. The intention was to wear the movement down by wearing the women down. You will notice that both the force-feeding and the Cat and Mouse Act, the two primary tools of state response to the hunger strikes, operated on the same principle: the woman's body as the site of state authority. When she removed her cooperation, the state asserted control over her body directly. The argument being made in physiological rather than rhetorical terms was this: you may not withdraw from this system, you may not opt out. Your body is within our jurisdiction regardless of what your mind has decided. Lady Constance Lytton's story illuminates this with unusual clarity, because it shows you the system working in two different registers depending on whose body it was operating on. The body of a woman with the title received consideration. The body of a seamstress received a tube. And the distinction was not about medical assessment, it was about social weight. Constance Lytton suffered a serious stroke in 1912. She died in 1923 at the age of 54. Her letters were compiled and published by her sister, Lady Betty Balfour. She's not the most famous name in the suffragette movement, but she is, in some ways, the clearest mirror it produced. The reason her story belongs in this particular account, an account of what Edwardian women did with their afternoons, is the connection it reveals between two worlds that were physically very close and socially very far apart. The woman at the drawing-room window receiving her afternoon calls, managing her card tray, maintaining her social network with precision and intelligence, and the woman in the prison cell being force-fed through a tube, because her name did not carry the weight required for protection. Both are Edwardian women. Both are, in their different ways, subject to exactly the same underlying system. The system that said a woman's value was determined by her social position, her husband's name, her family's rank. For the lady at the window, this system provided considerable comfort. It gave her a room, a role, an authority within the domestic world. It gave her afternoons that were genuinely hers, and a social world that she, not her husband, controlled. The constraints of that world were real, but so were its rewards. She was not nothing. She was, within her territory, a great deal, and you has been in that room with her all evening. For the seamstress, and for the women who were being force-fed in the name of the same argument, the system provided nothing but its demand. The expectation of passivity without the compensation of comfort, the requirement of submission without the gift of a drawing-room. Lady Constance Lytton understood this distinction. She lived on one side of it, saw the other side clearly, and chose to cross it, not metaphorically but literally, with a pair of scissors and a working-class name. The fact that crossing it left her with a stroke and a shortened life is not incidental to the story. It is the story. The afternoon tea world and the prison cell are not opposites. They are two expressions of the same social arrangement, and the women who occupied them, one with silver spoons and one with hunger strikes, were all living inside a system that had, as its foundation, the conviction that what women did was not quite real, not quite consequential, not quite worth accounting for. The drawing-room woman knew this in the way that comfortable people know uncomfortable truths. She managed it. She made something within it. She was extraordinary in many cases at making something within it. Perhaps you too have made something within constraints that were not of your choosing, but the structure was the structure, and some women decided not to make something within it. Some women decided the structure itself needed to change. You are drifting now, and that is the right thing to be doing. The afternoon is ending. The light outside has shifted. That particular shift from gold to blue-grey that happens in October in England, when the days are closing in and the fires feel necessary rather than decorative. The drawing-room is settling. The last caller went home an hour ago. The card tray has been reviewed. The evening is beginning its preparations. Let the room come into focus for a moment. You are in it. And then let it soften. She is sitting by the fire now, the woman at the centre of this afternoon, the one whose day we've been following since the writing desk this morning. She is, let's say, 42. She has been married for 17 years. She has 3 children who are largely in the care of a governess and a nursemaid. She has a household of 9 people below stairs, who she has managed with the competence and the invisible authority that the system requires. She has conducted 4 calls this afternoon, managed a complicated conversation about seating at next month's dinner with precisely the right amount of indirection, and added 2 new names to a list of people she is considering introducing to each other. You know the kind of competence this is. You've seen it, or exercised it, or both. She is not unhappy. That is the most important thing to say about her, and the thing that histories of this world most consistently get wrong. She is not a victim waiting to be rescued by history. She's a person who lives inside a set of arrangements, the way all people live inside arrangements, and who has found within those arrangements a life that is hers. She has her pleasures, not just the formal pleasures of the social world, but the quieter ones. A novel from the circulating library that she's been reading, 10 minutes at a time, in the mornings before the housekeeper comes. A correspondence with her cousin in Edinburgh that has been running for 11 years and contains, in its accumulated pages, more honest thought than she has expressed to anyone in her household. A charity committee she chairs, genuinely, and whose work she believes in. A fund for the families of men injured in industrial accidents, which she's grown from a small subscription list to something that now operates in 3 boroughs. No one calls it her work. It is her charitable interest. But she knows what it is. The charity committee has been running for 6 years. She started it after reading a newspaper account of a factory accident in Bermondsey, a belt drive failure that took 3 men's hands and left their families with nothing, because the factory's owner had not felt legally obligated to provide anything. She clipped the article. She put it in a drawer. She thought about it for 2 weeks. You know that feeling. The thing you read that stayed with you, that eventually made you do something. And then she wrote 12 letters to 12 women she knew, who also had comfortable incomes and the kind of social networks that could be converted, if necessary, into fundraising capacity. 7 of them replied. The fund that those 7 women built from a dinner-table conversation in her drawing room now provides for 11 families across 3 boroughs. She knows all 11 families by name. She visits 2 of them personally at intervals, which is something she does not mention at dinner parties and has not told her husband the full detail of. She is not performing charity. She is doing something she has decided is necessary, with the resources and the skills she has, because the alternative is knowing about a problem and doing nothing. She is constitutionally unsuited to that. This is who she is. Not the performance of the afternoon calls, though she does those well. Not the seating chart for next week's dinner, though she will get it right. This, the 11 families, the letters she wrote 6 years ago on a Monday morning when she decided that knowing about something and doing nothing about it was no longer something she was willing to accept. You recognise something in that, perhaps. The correspondence with Edinburgh is 32 pages long as of last autumn. Her cousin, a woman 3 years younger, who married a professor and lives in a tall Georgian house near the university, writes with a candour that is almost startling when compared with the rest of the letters in the house. The Edinburgh letters do not observe the conventions of social correspondence. They say what they think. They disagree. They push back. They are, in the accumulated record of 11 years, one of the fullest portraits of what this woman actually believes, as opposed to what she says at dinner. She has not shown these letters to anyone. They are in a box in the room she uses as a sitting room, the one her husband does not enter. She reads them when she needs to remember who she is when no one is watching. That is not a small thing. It may be, in fact, the most important thing she owns. The fire settles. A coal shifts. Outside, the sound of the street is dimming. She's not thinking about suffragettes tonight. She's thinking about the seating for next week's dinner, about whether her husband's colleague from the Foreign Office should be placed near the woman from the Literary Society, or whether that would be too stimulating and produce exactly the kind of charged conversation that her husband finds difficult the next morning. She is thinking, in other words, about the same things she always thinks about. The management of the room, the maintenance of the world. There is a version of this story that ends with her wishing she could be somewhere else, wishing she could be marching or arguing or breaking windows. And perhaps somewhere inside her there is that wish. But if you ask her, if you could sit across from her in this cooling drawing room and simply ask, she would probably say something careful and warm about the value of each person finding their particular contribution, and mean it mostly. And also, if she trusted you enough, add something quiet about the cousin in Edinburgh and the charity committee and the years of correspondence and the particular satisfaction of a well-run room. Because this is what she knows. The afternoon was hers. It was always hers. The drawing room, the calls, the card tray, the social network she's maintained like a garden for 17 years. These were never nothing. They were the way she existed in the world. They were the way she mattered. The way she mattered. It was just that no one called them that. No one had a word for it. The system required too much of her intelligence and returned too little of the name for what that intelligence was doing, and that gap between the work and the word is what this history has spent a century and a half trying to close. You're very comfortable right now. Let the fire settle. Let the light go. The afternoon ends. Another one will come tomorrow, and she will be ready. The room is very quiet now. You've been in it for a while. You've seen how it works. The tray in the hall, the drawing room, the fire, the afternoon hours. You understand it in the way that spending time in a place gives you understanding. Not just the facts of it, the feeling of it. And the feeling is settling now, the way rooms settle when the last light leaves them. Your body has been still for some time. You may not have noticed. The stillness has just been there, gathering around you, the way warmth gathers around a fire. Your shoulders have dropped, your hands are loose, your breathing has found its own pace, slow and even, without you having to do anything about it. That's good. That's exactly right. The Edwardian evening has arrived. Outside, in that London we've been visiting, the lamplighter is making his rounds. He's a man with a long pole, and he touches the gas jets at each street corner one by one, and the lamps bloom into orange light, one after another, down the length of the street. The shadows under the railings deepen. The footsteps on the pavement slow. In the houses the fires have been built up for evening. The drawing rooms, which were full of conversation and cards and careful social calculation 3 hours ago, are quiet now. The lady of each house has withdrawn to change for dinner. The calling hours are over. The world has shifted into its evening register, which is softer and warmer and considerably easier on everyone. You are in that evening register now too. There's nothing you need to do. There's nothing you need to remember. The drawing room has been managed. The card tray has been sorted. The social world, that intricate and demanding network of obligations and alliances and carefully maintained relationships, is resting. It will still be there tomorrow. It always is. Tonight, it is not your responsibility. Your breathing is slow, in and out. The air moves easily. There's no effort in it. Your chest rises and falls on its own, without instruction, the way it has done every night of your life. The fire in the grate has settled into embers, not the bright crackling fire of the afternoon, that demanded attention, demanded the room to be arranged around it, demanded to be noticed. This is the other kind of fire, the quiet kind, the kind that gives warmth without requiring anything back. You are that kind of fire now. The sounds of the evening are around you, very soft, the settling of a house, the distant sound of a city that is becoming quieter, street by street as the hours move toward midnight. Somewhere outside, a cab horse. Somewhere inside, the last creak of the stairs as the household completes its evening duties and finds its way to rest. Everything is finding its way to rest. Your thoughts are still moving, the way thoughts do, but they are moving slowly, slowly, the way the last leaves of autumn move in still air, not going anywhere in particular, not needing to, just drifting. If there's anything you are holding on to from today, you can let it go now. There is nothing in your hands tonight that needs holding. Whatever it was, a conversation, a decision, a question that hasn't been answered yet, it can wait. It will all be there in the morning. The morning is a very long way away. Right now there is only the fire and the quiet. The drawing room is exactly as it was when the last caller left. The furniture hasn't moved. The card tray is in its place on the hall table. The house is still the way houses are still when everyone in them is drifting towards sleep, when the rooms are breathing at the same slow rate. The afternoon is a long way behind you. The morning calls, the visiting, the card with the folded corner, the cut direct, the tray of names ranked in their careful order. All of it is history now. Not just Edwardian history, your history, the thing you carried through the evening without quite knowing you were carrying it. You can set it down. The evening in London is very still. The fog has come in, the way it does in October, soft and grey at the edges of things, making the lamplight diffuse and gentle. The street is quiet, the house is quiet, the drawing room is quiet, and you are very, very comfortable. There's a particular quality of warmth that comes in the last hour before sleep. It's not the warmth of effort or conversation, or the social performance of the afternoon. It's the warmth that the body makes for itself, quietly, without drama, when it has decided that the day is done. Your body has made that decision. You can trust it. The card tray doesn't need you tonight. The fire settles. A small sound, a brief brightening, and then the quiet again. Your eyes are heavy. They have been for a while. There's no need to fight it. The afternoon has been understood. The women who lived in those rooms have been seen. The lady at the writing desk, the pioneer who called her friends by their surnames, the woman with the stock ticker, the daughter of the Viceroy of India who cut her hair and changed her name and crossed the line to see what the other side looked like. They have all gone home now, and so, very nearly have you. The fog is soft against the windows. The lamplight is orange and still. The house is breathing. The fire is the colour of old amber. You are drifting. Somewhere in London in 1907, a woman is laying out her calling cards for tomorrow. She's doing it by habit, with the particular calm of someone who has done something so many times that the action has become its own kind of rest. She knows what each card means. She knows what tomorrow will bring. She has made something in this world. With these hours, with these afternoons, she closes the case. The evening is complete, and you are already almost somewhere else. That soft, warm, borderless place that is neither the drawing room nor your own room, but something in between. The place that arrives just before sleep. The place where the afternoon dissolves. The house is very still. The fire is very low. Your breathing is slow and even, and your body's completely at rest. The afternoon was extraordinary. She knew what she was doing, and you have been, for a little while, in her world. Rest now. The cards are all in order. The afternoon is done.